Hi everyone and welcome along. Today we're going to do another of our simple landscape paintings, but this time we're going to feature a weeping willow tree. So grab your paints and let's get started. I have taped down my piece of paper and that is to help it prevent itself from warping because we're going to use quite a lot of water on this piece. You could also use a block of watercolour paper, which is something I sometimes use, which is when you have a pad of paper that's glued all around the edge to do the same job. Now, if you haven't already had a look at my introduction to landscape painting, this was the piece I painted in my watercolour quick fix playlist in a video called Getting Started with Landscape Painting, and it was all about being clever with simple watercolour techniques using the lovely blends contrasted with really crisp items in the foreground. Well, we're going to build upon that and we're going to paint in a landscape, and we're going to add in a weeping willow tree, which is something that I get asked to do a lot, particularly by my patrons who get to, as part of their subscription and their membership, they get to make requests and suggestions for content for the watercolour tutorials on YouTube. So I'm using my big one-stroke brush and I'm mixing up a very dilute blue combining French ultramarine and a little bit of Prussian blue, and I am going to create a sort of sky on my page, but first I'm just going to get rid of quite a lot of that colour and first just put down a bit of water in general. So I'll just move that other large brush out the way and wet my page. So I'm just doing it lightly, and for all of these kinds of simple steps, things like how much water to use to wet your page and things, that is all in the Watercolour Quick Fix playlist, where you can find 5-minute videos just focusing on a single technique such as that. Okay, so now I'm going to pick up some of this blue mix and I'm going to sweep it across the top, and I'm going to get even more colour on my brush. Lovely. And I'm not going to go too far with it. I'm just going to sweep that in, and I quite like the ever so faint lines that will probably blend themselves out and fade out. Now the next thing I'm going to do, similar to that first landscape painting that I just showed you, is I'm going to put in a horizon line of faint trees reflecting in the distance. Now I've got Sap Green here. I'm working quite fast to make sure the page doesn't dry too quickly. What's very interesting is in the UK at the moment we've just had a very, very hot week in our summer, where temperatures really were the highest they've been for a long while, and when you're painting watercolour in those temperatures it's hard to keep your page wet for long enough. So luckily it's cooled down a little bit, so I'm mixing in some Sap Green, Prussian blue and burnt sienna just to knock that back a bit, and I am going to dab the brush. I'm going to take my horizon line just here, and I'm going to make my dabs a bit sort of bigger at towards the side, and then a little bit smaller towards the middle, so we sort of go off into the distance. And that is just a really fun way of creating a horizon, and I'm just adding a little bit more Sap Green in at the sides just because those trees are a little bit closer to us, but it's all about using the simplicity and effectiveness of watercolour techniques to create this setting for us. So we need to let this dry 100% and then we're going to paint our weeping willow. This is all completely dry now, so touch dry. It needs to be completely dry, and I have mixed up the Sap well, not next, it's not sap green, it's green gold, it's next to sap green. And I do always like to say, if you don't have green gold in your palette, then sap green and cadmium yellow mixed together will give you something very similar. And I'm going to, with my size 6 brush, just sweep across, creating a nice bank, and it's just going to taper off. And I'm going to just clean my brush off and make it just a little bit broader there. In our first landscape painting, we did everything in the foreground much darker, but actually this time we're going to look at creating it being more of a focal piece and allowing the light to shine down on it a bit more. So now I've got some sap green, and I'm just going to work into the edges of it there, and as it comes down to the water, it's just going to have a little more darkness going on as it meets the water's edge. And we will be looking at reflection and shadow in a bit, but just for now, I've just got a bit of shadow mix of burnt sienna and French ultramarine blue, just giving us a little bit more depth as it reaches the water's edge. But for now we're going to focus on our weeping willow tree, and I have got some yellow ochre here and then some burnt sienna, and then mixed in to create shadow with some French ultramarine. I'm going to begin by painting upwards, blending up from the bank and putting in a weeping willow trunk. Now, a weeping willow tree has an amazing sort of amount of curve and sort of elegant bend in it, and I want to really capture that. So I'm doing it by, I want to make sure it's not just a dark tree trunk, so that's why I start with the yellow ochre, but whilst it is still wet, I'm going to be blending into it with the burnt sienna and the shadow mix itself, because we do have some colour in the background to contend with. And the other important thing is, because a weeping willow tree has the most incredible boughs of leaves, and which we will get to, we need to make sure that they are not fighting against a really dark trunk as well. So we're just keeping it relatively minimal in terms of the darkness at this point. It is one of my favourite things to do, is to sort of start filling in branches and then just dropping in extra little bits of darkness as we go. So keep sort of, start from your central branch, central trunk, and then just start to think about how things will become a little slimmer and a little bit more curved. And with a weeping willow there's always a lot of movement. I would highly recommend that you have a look at some photos of the real thing before you have a go. So you see how each branch is just sort of coming down off the previous one. And if you've got a slightly wobbly hand like I seem to today, that actually works really nicely. So I'm just going to fill in all the branches and then we'll start to put in our leaves. We've now got a nice shape, and I should mention that I was doing most of that with my 4/10 brush, so a really nice small brush. Now we're going to look at painting in the leaves, and so I'm going to use the 4/10 but also the 2/10, because otherwise we'll be here all day trying to do everything with our smallest brush. Up here I've got my cadmium yellow. I've mixed in a bit of sap green in there, and the cadmium yellow colour is so important in your watercolour palette because it's just a little bit opaque, and it is a really helpful colour for when you need to paint something that really needs to show up even though it's a lightest colour. So when we're going to sort of get these leaves going, we want to start with a nice light colour and then build our way up into adding more sort of deeper greens and things. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by painting in series of sort of dotty hanging branches of leaves, and they are hanging down, and they are sort of, they don't need to all be kind of completely perfect and even, but what I do want at this beginning point is to go in with these nice lighter colours and just begin building up the shape. So you'll see that I'm starting to paint sort of out from the branches that I've already painted, because we don't need to have every single branch painted in, because the shape and bulk of these leaves will do that job for us. And then we've got a slightly more challenging task down here where there's some green in the background, but it's absolutely fine, because when we come to adding deeper green colours we will be able to really highlight that. But what's fantastic about the cadmium yellow is it's doing a really sterling job for this first go. So I'm just going to fill in my tree with a series of these little dots, and they are sort of tapering off. So we start with a big sort of broader cluster at the top, and they taper down into almost a sort of single strand, like a very sort of elongated, strange bunch of grapes, if you will. And I'm enjoying sort of using up all the colour on my brush to make a real range of tones. This is just from adding more water to the brush. It's so important to capture the range of greens that you get when you're painting any kind of tree or foliage. It's partly down to how the sunlight hits that tree and how we see various shady parts, but also there are just so many tones of green, and on a tree you're going to have leaves bursting into life just at slightly different intervals depending on how much sunlight they're getting. So some might have more of a yellowy tone than others. As I come to an end of this stage, what I'm also looking for is just little places where I can add a little bit of this more dilute greenery to areas that maybe just want a little bit of filling out, that aren't necessarily sort of strong areas of adding green in the foreground. And all of this has been done by using this one mix of Sap Green and Cadmium Yellow, and you can see already the wonderful range we get from just adding that colour. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start adding in deeper layers. So I've got Sap Green just on its own here, and I'm going to use a smaller brush, my 4/10 now, to begin a next layer of detail with this more concentrated colour. And especially in this area here where it's a little bit hard to see, it's going to be very useful. So what I'm doing is I'm just sort of picking out the low lights, I suppose, of the areas that I've already painted in, but I can also add a few new sections. So we're going to go through just adding in little bits of extra detail, and in the same way as you did previously, you can absolutely sort of get a more dilute green on the brush and extend the range of colour that you're including on this weeping willow. We're just trying to fill out the shape and also now the depth of colour on this tree. So you can see that I'm just sort of almost doing little sort of apostrophe curves, and then more of the dark green towards the base of each sort of drop. So all the time we're building up the shape and the sort of bushiness of this tree. And now for one last layer of depth, it's going to be the shadow layer, which is going to feature both on the tree trunk itself. So here we've got a size 4/10 brush, and I'm just going through looking for areas in which I can, on one hand, add a bit of shadow to the branches, but also just in there add maybe a few more branches in a really fine line, and it just adds a little bit more sort of realism to the painting. Trying to imagine the branches sort of poking through. Especially these ones sort of along the top or along the ends. You quite often with a weeping willow see the branches curling over like that. If you are enjoying this kind of direction of painting more sort of landscapes, trees, more fully fledged paintings, then I highly recommend that you have a look at my Patreon, because it is all about painting in a more sort of fully formed, doing paintings and landscapes, and we've done house paintings. We basically go into way more detail than I do on the YouTube channel, and what I love about the YouTube channel is it's there as a free resource, and we do so much on here, and I quite often refer to it when teaching a Patreon class. But the lovely thing about Patreon is we've got a really lovely community of painters. At the time of film we've got over 400 members, and they get to talk to me whenever they need with questions about their paintings and really develop their skills as creators. Anyway, I'll stop banging on about that and get back to the job in hand. So that has just given our branches just a little bit more, and now I am going to get a larger brush to do my mixing, because otherwise we'd be here all day. A bit of Sap Green and that French Ultramarine blue to get an even deeper colour. And this time I am going to take my 2/10 brush, not my smallest, and because I want to work in a slightly looser, larger manner, and I'm looking for the more shadowy places in this tree. And it's not so much about painting in individual leaves, it's more about filling out the more shady areas of the tree, but keeping the brush light and moving about. You're creating texture even when you're working with slightly larger brush strokes. The last stage of this piece is to think about the reflection in the water and the shadows on the grass there. I've got a size 8 brush, and what I'm just going to do is I'm going to wet this section, this bottom section of the page once more, and you can see I just allowed the brush to run over the base of that there, of the bank, and I'm going to get some of my shadow colour, and we're going to start to create a bit of a reflection in the water. So just starting very gently by using a very, very dilute bit of shadow that on one hand is picking up the wetness of the page, but also you can just see here just above where I wetted the page I can do some very sort of dilute back and forth horizontal strokes, and the unpainted space there is creating almost like a ripple effect. But what I want to do first is to get a vague sense of a reflection in the water. So I've got my my green gold, beg your pardon, just much paler, reflecting in the bank. A bit more of that deep colour. And of course we did add a little bit of Sap Green to the bank as well. Just go really cautiously with this kind of section. You don't want to go too far and all the good work you've done so far suddenly get a little bit overworked. And now I've got that in, I'm now going to allow that section to dry, because I'm actually going to look for more of these kind of textured bits. But what I can do is I can put some shadow in on the bank whilst we wait for that section at the bottom to dry. So I'm mixing up my shadow colour again, and I'm going to take my smallest brush because I just want to go quite cautiously. And the light is going to shine through a weeping willow, so we need to sort of dapple the brush. And I'm going to go back in for water. I'm not going to keep using shadow the whole time because I want this to be a light touch kind of thing that we can build up. And gradually we will start to get a nice shadow on the bank of the light dappled through the tree onto the grass. And it dries so beautifully. And then just a bit more darkness down into the water because we're going to start to introduce some reflection. So with this you can see I'm just adding a few more layers of the darkness in various areas, and the thing with watercolour is it's very easy to add but it's a bit harder to take away, so just work your way up slowly in layers. Okay, I'm going to allow this to dry 100% and then we'll finish off with some reflection. This is now touch dry, and I've got my size 2 brush, and I'm just mixing up a very dilute bit of shadow, and I'm going to begin with a fairly sort of loose hand. Don't get too sort of tense and nervous about this, and I'm just going to begin by placing in some very dilute shadow with just adding a bit more water here and there as I go, going right up to the bank. And I'm not adding any more colour now, it's just all water, but it will dry in a lovely translucent rippled manner. Now as I sort of create this, I'm basically creating a bed for some reflections to sit in. So I don't want it to dry 100%, so I'm working fairly quickly just in this area directly beneath the tree. You can just see ever so slightly those tiny little areas of unpainted space. Okay. I'm now going to take some of the colour of the tree trunk, but I'm going to just add in a little bit of shadow to it and knock it back. And I'm going to look there and I'm just going to add in the tiniest bit of the colour, still painting in a similar dash, horizontal dash way. Now we're not going to just see a trunk going up, we're going to see branches coming off to the side, coming down, just mirroring what we see here, but very gently, very faintly. And then, as I did with my actual tree trunk, I'm going to drop in tiny bit. Because remember, watercolour dries so much lighter that if you do feel like you're putting in too much, don't panic. As much as I want you to go cautiously with it, I also don't want you to spend hours painstakingly trying to add in a tiny drop of colour at a time. And then as we get down here, I'm just going to add in more, because of course we've also got not only the reflection but the actual shadow of the tree coming down. Now I'm going to start to drop in little bits of tree reflection, starting with the lightest colour, still using that reflection ripple in the water. Trying to just sort of match up where the branches fall, but of course we're going to get to the point where it's just all leaf. But it's just so important to try and keep those bits of unpainted space in there where the light is hitting the ripples. And we want the whole thing to just be fainter than its the real tree in the water. And so you might get to the point where you haven't actually added ripples into the water, so you can just sort of keep adding more if need be, more bits of water strokes. And then we can start to add a bit more of the green. So I think you get the idea, is we're just trying to paint it upside down in reflection, competing with the ripples, competing with the water on our page drying, and trying not to get too heavy with it. To finish off this painting, we can just frame it a little bit by bringing in a few ripples from the side, still with my size 2 brush, still using the shadowy colour . If your ripples just look a bit too strong, all you need to do, clean your brush off and just come back over them and soften them a little bit. But there we have a weeping willow tree, and the most satisfying bit of using washi tape is to be able to peel it off. So we shall do that and create in the process a really nice frame for our painting. And there you go. A weeping willow tree in a simple watercolour landscape. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed that one. I want to say a massive thank you to my patrons for their support, because that support enables me to keep creating these videos that everyone can enjoy. And if you enjoyed it, then hit the like button and comment below to let me know how you're getting on. And of course, if you subscribe, then you'll never miss another video. Until next time,